Welcome to Module 5, MTSS Essential Component Progress Monitoring. Before we start the module, have you printed the Module 5 participant workbook? If you haven't, pause the recording and download the workbook from the website. This session has several interactive module activities that you'll need the participant workbook for. The Wyoming Department of Education, in partnerships with the American Institutes for Research, has developed an introductory MTSS professional development series to support rollout of MTSS and the use of evidence-based practices. The WDE strongly believes implementation of MTSS can support districts in implementing several state initiatives, support continuous improvement, improve chronically failing schools, and increase the student achievement and reduce behavior problems. This session will focus on MTSS Essential Component Progress Monitoring. It is the fifth module in a series of 7. The content presented today should in no way be viewed as exhaustive or legally binding. You should continue to seek and participate in ongoing professional development related to the topics presented in this and future sessions. By the end of this session, participants will be able to define progress monitoring and its purposes within an MTSS framework, explain how districts and schools can use the NCII tools chart to select and evaluate progress monitoring tools, and describe the components of a progress monitoring process. Multi-tiered Systems of Support, or MTSS in Wyoming, is a prevention framework for school improvement made up of 4 essential components. The 4 components are screening, multi-level prevention system, or tiers of support, progress monitoring, and database decision-making. MTSS in Wyoming also encompasses features such as culturally responsive instruction, family engagement, and evidence-based instruction. As you will notice in the graphic, each of the components and features contribute to improved student outcomes. This session will focus on progress monitoring and how it is used with database decision-making to improve student outcomes. Is progress monitoring really that important? In an analysis of research on student progress monitoring that considered only experimental controlled studies, Fuchs and Fuchs found that when teachers use systematic progress monitoring to track their students' progress in reading, math, and spelling, they were better able to identify students in need of additional or different forms of instruction. They designed stronger instructional programs, and their students achieved better. Progress monitoring is also important in meeting the requirements under the Individuals with Disabilities Act of 2004. Prior to the referring a student suspected of having a learning disability for special education testing, schools must ensure that the underachievement is not due to lack of instruction in reading or math. IDA also states that schools must consider progress monitoring data, or more specifically, database documentation of repeated assessments of achievement at reasonable intervals, reflecting formal assessment, student progress, and instruction. And as you can see, these data should be provided to students' parents. Progress monitoring data allows teams to estimate the rates of improvement across time, both at the individual and group level. It allows schools to compare the efficacy of different forms of instruction and intervention. It helps them identify who are not demonstrating adequate progress, and it also helps them determine when an instructional change is needed. Take a moment and think of a time when you provided extra support or intervention to a student who was struggling. How did you know he or she was benefiting? What data did you use? In this module, we'll talk about the types of tools that teachers might use to progress monitor and what types of decisions they'll need to make using progress monitoring data. Progress monitoring is defined as repeated measurement of student performance over the course of an intervention to quantify responsiveness to an intervention and to thus determine on the ongoing basis when adjustments to the program are needed to improve responsiveness. There are 2 critical features of progress monitoring. The first is the selection of a valid and reliable progress monitoring tool that have sufficient forms, number of forms or probes, and established rates of improvement and benchmarks. The second is a valid progress monitoring process, which includes processes for setting goals, establishing schedules for collecting and reviewing progress monitoring data, and monitoring fidelity of implementation. In this section, we will discuss each of these in more detail. Identifying an appropriate progress monitoring tool is the first step. The National Center on Intensive Interventions provides 2 tools charts to support schools and districts in selecting academic and behavioral progress monitoring tools. Throughout this presentation, we will be referring to the tools charts and how they can help teams determine how to select and evaluate MTSS progress monitoring tools. Before we look at criteria for an MTSS progress monitoring tool, it is important to make a distinction between 2 common formal academic progress monitoring tools indicated in the tools chart. The first one is General Outcome Measure, and the second is Mastery Measure. The key difference between Mastery Measure and General Outcome Measures, or GOMS, is the comparability of data longitudinally, or the ability to look at data across time. With GOMS, you can compare the score of a student score they received in May to a score he or she received in September. This cannot be done with mastery measures because each subskill is tracked separately. These subskills do not necessarily correlate well with overall achievement. Let's look at an example of mastery measurement. Using a predetermined scope and sequence, the teacher administers an assessment of a specific skill being taught. In this case, it is decoding words with short vowel A. Following each probe, the teacher graphs the student results. As you can see in the first weeks of specific skill instruction, the student did not get many answers correct. However, as the weeks went by, the student improved until he was able to reach mastery on this skill, which in this case was 3 consecutive weeks of 80% or more words read correctly. After mastering the first objective, the teacher moves to the next learning objective in the curriculum, short vowel I. Similar to before, the teacher charts the student's progress on the specific skill being taught. Look at the data. What do you see? After several weeks of instruction, the student did master the second skill. One difference is that it took the student longer to master the second skill than it took to master the first skill. What questions do teams have about students' progress in these types of situations? Potential questions might be, is the student progressing at the same rate as his peers? Is he maintaining the previously mastered skill? Or does this student generalize these skills to novel texts, settings, and situations? There are several advantages for using Mastery Measure. By focusing on a single skill, practitioners can assess a student learn a target skill in isolation. Teachers can use the information from the ongoing progress monitoring data to make decisions about changing the target skill instruction. Until recently, the psychometric properties of most mastery measures were not valid and reliable. However, there is increasing research demonstrating the validity and reliability of some mastery measurement tools. While there are several advantages, there are also several limitations to using only mastery measures for MTSS progress monitoring. Most commonly is that the data do not reflect skill maintenance or generalization. In addition, the number of objectives mastered does not really correlate well to performance on criterion measures like state tests. Measurement methods are often designed by teachers using unknown reliability and validity. And as mentioned earlier, scores cannot be compared longitudinally. General outcome measures often assess the limitations associated with mastery measures. A general outcome is program dependent. As a result, it reflects overall competence in the year-long curriculum, as opposed to being dependent on a single instructional sequence or particular program. General outcome measures describe how students are growing and how they develop over time. In addition, GOMS provide decision-making model for designing and evaluating interventions. It can be used for individual students or for groups of students. When graphed, weekly GOMS are compared to a predetermined expected growth per week and an intervention goal. Unlike mastery measures, teachers will use probes that assess end-of-year outcomes versus specific sub-skills needed to achieve broader outcomes. This allows teachers to evaluate whether students are not only learning new skills, but are they able to maintain the mastered skills and generalize them to new passages or probes. While there is a significant amount of research for reading GOMS, there is emerging research in other academic areas, such as math, writing, and spelling. The focus of general outcome measures is on repeated measures of performance. General outcome measures make no assumptions about instructional hierarchy for determining measurement. In other words, GOMS fit with any instructional approach. Also, they incorporate automatic tests of retention and generalization. Therefore, the teacher is constantly able to assess whether the student is retaining what was taught earlier in the year. For screening purposes, general outcome measures are preferred because they do a better job of classifying students into a risk and not at risk category. For general progress monitoring, it is recommended that a general outcome measure be used to assess overall progress, while mastery measures or other informal assessments can be used to assess why a student is struggling. Now that you understand the two main types of academic progress monitoring tools, let's review the criteria for progress monitoring tools in both behavior and academics. Find Handout 5.1 in your participant workbook. This is an excerpt of the Wyoming MTSS Fidelity Implementation Rubric. This handout only includes criteria related to progress monitoring. In the first row, last column, you will see specific criteria required for MTSS progress monitoring tools. Criteria 1 requires that they have a sufficient number of alternate forms that are of equal and controlled difficulty to allow for progress monitoring at recommended intervals based on intervention levels. Alternate forms are parallel versions of the same measure within a grade. The alternate form are all comparable difficulty. The minimum number of alternate forms depends on the tier of instruction. For Tier 2, there's a minimum of 9 alternate forms to allow for a minimum monthly progress monitoring. Since Tier 3 requires more frequent progress monitoring, the progress monitoring tools would need at least 20 alternate forms or probes of the same difficulty. Information found on the NCII tools chart can help you find out if your tool meets the minimum requirements. Once on the tools chart, you will select the Progress Monitoring tab and review the data in the first column. Handout 5.2 provides a guide to using the tools chart to help identify where your tool meets the criteria. Similarly, behavior progress monitoring tools must allow educators to assess progress in the same standardized way over time. The second criteria requires that the tool have specified minimum acceptable growth. This is often referred to as rate of improvement and can be found here on the tools chart. Educators can use rates of improvement to set progress monitoring goals. In addition, they can compare students' progress to these specified rates of improvement to make decisions about responsiveness to the intervention. A third criteria requires the tool to provide benchmarks for minimum acceptable end-of-year performance. In instances where screening and progress monitoring are the same type of tool, the benchmarks are being referred to with screening too. Benchmarks are useful in setting progress monitoring goals as well. With behavior progress monitoring tools, information on both of these criteria can be found under the progress monitoring levels of specific performance. On Handouts 5.1, you'll also find a second criteria, or a fourth criteria for progress monitoring tools. The first part of the final criteria requires that tools have available reliability and validity information for the performance level score. Unlike the previous criteria, information for criteria 4 is located under the psychometrics tab. The required information can be found here. You will notice that there are additional criteria that teams may consider when selecting and evaluating tools. For behavior tools, data are available for overall reliability and validity. You will notice there's a second part of criteria 4. It's not enough just to have access to a tool that meets all the criteria. Staff must be able to articulate the supporting evidence. In other words, staff need to be aware of the strengths and limitations of the tools they're using for progress monitoring. Now we'll look at the second feature of the progress monitoring process. As you saw with the criteria for alternate forms for progress monitoring occurs at least monthly for students receiving Tier 2 and at least weekly for students receiving Tier 3. Is that enough? The question is, what does the research say? We do know that as the number of data points increases, the effects of measurement error, or our confidence on the trend line, decreases. We have found in previous studies that it's recommended that you have about 6 to 9 data points in order to get enough data to make a confident decision. For behavior progress monitoring, data may be collected daily or even multiple times a day, depending on the frequency and intensity of the problem behavior. Criteria 2 of the progress monitoring process requires procedures are in place to ensure implementation accuracy, also known as fidelity of implementation. What progress monitoring processes do teams need to have fidelity to? In order for a school to ensure implementation accuracy of the progress monitoring process, they must have clearly written procedures for identifying students in need of progress monitoring, setting goals, collecting data, and making decisions using ongoing processes. By putting procedures in writing, schools can monitor the accuracy of implementation of each process. Using the rubric we used in the last couple of slides, take a moment and evaluate where your team or school is in terms of implementing progress monitoring. Start with level 5, which is the full criteria for full implementation, and identify to what extent you're implementing each of the criteria. Feel free to pause the recording and start when you're ready. In this section, we'll talk about the progress monitoring process, particularly about how to set good goals for progress monitoring. Setting valid goals is one of the most important progress monitoring procedures. If we do not have a clear guidance for setting progress monitoring goals, student learning may be impacted. Look at this student's progress monitoring data. The teacher uses a red star to indicate the end of intervention expectation or goal. He draws a red line, which is referred to as the goal line. The teacher set the goal at 40 words read correct. However, we do not know why the teacher set the goal this way or what it means if the student reaches the goal. At the end of the intervention, she shared with the parents and suggested that the student had made amazing progress and was ready for the next grade. Because we don't know why or how the goal was set, there are concerns. Was this valid data? Is this really the grade level expectation? How does he compare against his peers? In this next scenario, the teacher uses a validated goal-setting strategy based on end-of-year benchmarks for Tier 2 progress monitoring goals. By selecting the end-of-year benchmark as a goal, she is able to explain to the parents how and why the goal is selected. Making this goal more clearly indicates that the student has met grade level expectations and is ready for the next grade. How does setting the goal in this way change the team's interpretation of the data? It primarily provides confidence in the teacher's decision to talk with the parent about the child's progress. When considering goal-setting procedures, schools and districts must consider why and how the goal was set, how long the student has to achieve the goal, and what the student is expected to do when he achieves the goal. Once a goal is selected, the team needs to choose an intervention that is likely to help the student reach the goal. Establishing the baseline score is the first step in setting a progress monitoring goal. The baseline indicates the student's initial knowledge level or baseline knowledge. Baseline scores should be established using the same type of tool that will be used to collect the ongoing progress monitoring data. There are two recommended approaches. The first is to use student benchmark score from the universal screening. For the baseline to be valid, it is recommended that progress monitoring begin within 2 weeks of the collection of the benchmark score. The second approach is to administer 3 probes and select the median or select the average of 3 consecutive probes collected over multiple days. Take a moment and pull out Handout 5.3. We'll use this sheet to complete an activity. Here's Jane. During benchmarking, Jane's teacher administered 3 benchmark probes and selected the median score of 23 words read correctly. You will use this score to develop a realistic progress monitoring goal. In your handout, add Jane's baseline score just like this. The next step is to set Jane's goal. There are 2 recommended options for setting progress monitoring goals. The first is end-of-year or middle-of-year benchmarking. The second is using national norms or rates of improvement. These 2 approaches are most appropriate for students receiving Tier 2 supports. Let's look at these 2 options in more detail. The first option, end or middle of year benchmarking, is considered the most simplistic and will be appropriate for most students. With this option, the educator identifies the grade level benchmark score for the middle and end of year. The benchmark is represented on the graph by a star or an X at the date marking the end of the intervention. A goal line is then drawn between the baseline and the goal. It's important to note that most electronic data systems will assist educators in setting a benchmark progress monitoring goal and will draw the goal line once the goal is selected. For example, if the end of year benchmark was 60, then the teacher would place a star at 60. And then the teacher would draw a line between the baseline and the goal to create a goal line. For shorter interventions, the team could also use the winter benchmark score as the progress monitoring goal. So where do you find the benchmarks? Most published data systems provide the benchmarks within the system. Benchmarks can be found in the tool review for the NCII Academic Tools chart. Just click on End of Year Benchmark to identify the benchmarks submitted. The second option uses weekly rates of improvement, also referred to as ROI. This type of goal setting is used when the benchmark is unrealistic during the intervention time frame, but the student is expected to make growth comparable to his peers. The goal is set using a standardized formula. Many data systems will help educators calculate the goals based on growth. We use a standard formula for calculating rates of improvement. We start with the rate of improvement, which was provided by the publisher for 2 digits per week. And then we multiply it by the number of weeks left in the intervention and add that to the baseline score. This allows us to set a goal that the student is likely to meet given the intervention. So where do you find ROIs, or rates of improvement? Similar to benchmarks, most published data systems provide the ROI within the data system. You can also find ROI by grade on the NCII tools chart. Goal setting, like running, requires practice. Handout 5.4 provides an opportunity for you or your team to practice setting goals using rate of improvement or benchmarking. Take a couple minutes to calculate the scores or the benchmark scores for this student. Here are the answers for Handout 5.4. The goal using benchmark would be 60 because 60 was the benchmark for the spring. The norms for weekly rates of improvement was a 1.8 rate of improvement, allowed the teacher to calculate a goal of 52. This could be rounded up to 55 or down to 52 or 50. For a small group of students with severe challenging academic and behavior needs, using benchmark and rate of improvement can create unrealistic goals. In these cases, student performance is typically well below expectation, and the student is not likely to achieve grade level standards or expectations within 1 year. Educators may consider a third goal setting option, which is called Intra individual framework. Instead of using national benchmarks or norms, this approach uses students' previous growth rate to calculate an individualized goal. To use this option, educators collect at least 8 data points to identify the weekly rate of improvement for the target behavior. Because the student's performance is being compared to his or her performance and not a national or local norm, enough data are needed to demonstrate the existing performance rate. Most software can help you, like Excel, calculate an accurate estimate of student rate of improvement. When software is not available, student rate of improvement can be estimated by hand. This formula represents just one of the various approaches. When the 8 data points are available, the last median will be subtracted from the first median, or the first median will be subtracted from the last median, and the first median will be based on the first 3 scores. Here is an example of how this approach may be used. To use intra-individual framework, the team calculates the student rate of improvement by subtracting the median of the last 3 scores from the median of the first 3 scores. That is then divided by 7, or the number of actual instructional weeks, represented by 8 data points. In this case, the student's ROI is 1. The baseline score is then calculated using the median of the last 3 scores. This student's baseline score is 19, words read correctly. Finally, the team considers how to calculate the goal using the intra-individual framework formula. With this formula, the student rate of improvement is multiplied by 1.5 to ensure the student's growth is more than student growth in the previous weeks. That is multiplied by the number of instructional weeks remaining and added to the new baseline. So why do we use a 1.5 growth rate? We know that student rate of improvement is not sufficient to close the achievement gap. So we want to increase the growth at least 1.5 of what it previously was. A more ambitious goal may be set if appropriate. You should never lower the goal or change the intervention. Or you should change the intervention and never lower the goal. Similar to the previous activity, Handout 5.4 provides an opportunity for individuals or teams to practice setting goals using one of the strategies. Handout 5.5 allows users to calculate the intra-individual using data points provided over the last 8 weeks. Take a moment to calculate. The answers will be on the next slide. Hopefully, you also got 60 words read correct, or a goal of 59. The next part of this section will look at the progress monitoring process and how do we interpret progress monitoring data. Once goals are set, individualized programs are implemented. It is important to monitor student progress regularly. Standard decision rules guide decisions about how the adequacy of the student progress and the need to revise goals and instructional programs. The most simplistic decision rules are based on the 4-point rule, or the 4 most recent consecutive scores, or the student's trend line. Let's look at some examples. Decision rules based on the 4-point rule require students to have at least 6 data points over a 3-week period. The interpretation, though, is quite simple. If all 4 points are above the goal line, then the student is considered to have a positive response, and the team should continue doing what it's doing. If all 4 points are below the line, then the team should consider an instructional change, as the student is not responding. If the 4 data points are both above and below the line, the team does not really have enough data to determine where the student will end up in several weeks. In this case, the team collects data until there is a trend line rule or 4-point rule that can be applied. Let's try it out with a real student. Refer back to Handout 5.4, where you selected Jane's baseline goal or baseline score and her goal. Over the next 6 months, Jane scores the following on her progress monitoring. Chart them in the appropriate month. What do you see in her data? How would you describe her progress? Is it positive, poor, or questionable? Using the 4-point rule, we notice that the last 4 consecutive points are below the goal line. The team agrees that she is not responding to the intervention. The team will need to make a change to the intervention to ensure that she meets her goal by May. Earlier, we talked about how to calculate a trend line, but now we'll discuss how to use the trend line to make decisions. If 4 weeks of instruction have passed and you have at least 8 data points, then you're able to use the trend line analysis. Interpretation is quite simple. If the student's trend line is steeper than the goal line, then the student's end-of-year performance goal needs to be raised, or the intervention cut short. If the student's trend line is flatter than the goal line, then the teacher may consider revising the instructional program and ensuring fidelity of implementation. If the data is questionable, meaning it aligns with the goal line and the student trend line are the same, then there's nothing the team needs to do now but to continue progress monitoring. Let's apply the trend line analysis rule to Jane's data. A trend line uses existing data to predict future performance. The trend line is represented by a visual line, usually a dashed or dotted line. What do you see in her data? How would you describe her progress? Is it positive, poor, or questionable? In this case, the trend line analysis approach confirms the team's decision about Jane's progress. While she is making some progress, her progress is not sufficient for her to reach the end of intervention goal of 60 words read correct. Let's apply the trend line analysis to another student's progress monitoring data. What do you see here? Notice how the trend line is predicting the student will score well above his end-of-year goal if he continues with this level of support. In this case, the team may raise the goal if it isn't already at grade level expectations, or in the intervention early when the student meets the goal. In summary, the 4-point rule is easy to implement, but is not as sensitive. whereas the trendline rule is more sensitive to changes but requires calculation to obtain and requires more data points. More information about making decisions using progress monitoring data will be discussed in Module 6, Essential Component for High Quality Tier 2, and Module 7, Database Individualization for Tier 3. In this module, you learned about the key features of MTSS progress monitoring, including what are appropriate criteria for tool selection and what is the progress monitoring process. For more information, visit Wyoming's Project WIM website. You can reach it by going to wyominginstructionalnetwork.com and searching for MTSS. If you're looking for more information, consider these 3 websites. The first, intensiveintervention.org, is for the National Center on Intensive Intervention. The site has several resources for selecting tools, evaluating tools, and making decisions using progress monitoring data. RTI4Success.org is the website for the National Center on Response to Intervention, also known as MTSS. On this website, there are self-paced modules around how to use progress monitoring data for decision-making. Finally, IRIS offers a series of in-service trainings that are self-paced on progress monitoring, both how to conduct and interpret data. We recommend completing the Module 5 quiz in your participant workbook. If you're looking for the answers, contact Bart Lyman, the state MTSS coach. Prior to moving on to Module 6, we recommend practice goal setting and data interpretation. Once you feel comfortable, move on to Module 6 and learn how to apply that to interventions at Tier 2. If you would like more information or need assistance, please contact the Wyoming State MTSS coach, Bart Lyman, or Jennifer Heiler, the Wyoming SPDIG Grant Program Manager. We thank you for participating in this module, and we look forward to your participation in future modules.